So we're going to look at the driving forces in evolution. So basically the things that make evolution happen. Okay, and if you guys want to follow along, the PowerPoint is on Schoology, just so you can have it closer in front of you, however you want to do. Alright, so there are many different driving forces in evolution. So there is the natural driving force, so something like plate tectonics. So plate tectonics is how the different plates of the earth move. It's what causes mountains, it's what causes volcanoes, it's why the continents look the way they do. Climate change, so ice age has driven evolution, right? Animals who couldn't survive the ice age died out. Animals who could evolved so that they could survive the ice age better. And then human influences such as habitat destruction and fragmentation, and we'll talk about what both those mean, but there's lots of ways that humans have influenced evolution. Okay, so plate tectonics. Last class we talked about Pangea. Tegan, do you remember what Pangea was?
Like all the continents were together before
Yeah.
it evolved.
Exactly, before the plate tectonics started moving. So before the continents looked like they do today, so like North America, South America, all that stuff over there, okay, before it looked like that, it was all one big landmass. Everything was fit together. And have you guys ever noticed how, so South America kind of looks like that, right? And it's got its like, and then it kind of looks like
That was
Africa.
actually perfect. Good job.
And then Africa is kind of bigger and kind of looks like that. And how South America kind of fits right into Africa. Have you ever kind of noticed? It looks almost like exactly like a puzzle piece that'll fit together. And that's because plate tectonics, because they used to be right beside each other until they split. Alright, so species, gene pools or populations were split when Pangea split. Okay, so before, animals were able to roam kind of all over Pangea, and then it split. What's that? What's that?
Oh. How did it like all split? Was that from the ice age?
No, so the reason the plates move is because they're floating on top of lava. So it's like, it's almost like ice floating on top of a pond. Okay, and then things happened, the magma or lava got excited, and they split apart. So things just started breaking and moving, and just because there was fault lines or like areas that were easily broken, that's kind of where things started spreading apart. And it's just, they've just kind of been floating. Like everything feels really, really stable because in our sense it is, but everything's kind of just floating on the core, on the magma that's floating around there. It is kind of cool. So things move, and they move really slowly, and then the plates butt up against each other, and sometimes there's so much energy that gets pushed into there, they slip, or they slip, or they slip, and this causes an earthquake, this causes a mountain, and that causes a valley. Okay? Alright, so anyways, because the continents split apart, new habitats were created. Okay, because right, if North America used to be kind of close to the equator, it moved up, right, slowly, moved up, north, and now there's an area where it's cold, right, so that's a new habitat. So any animals that were living there had to learn how to adapt. So their genes helped them adapt into that environment. The climate changed. So some proof is the fact that Australia has more diverse species. And Australia was the first continent to split from Pangea. And just think of all the species that are in Australia, right? You got kangaroos, you got, I don't even know what's in Australia. Koalas, right? Those things ain't anywhere else.
Stingrays.
Okay, stingrays, right? Crazy things. And all those things were able to change and adapt to their surroundings, and they've had longer to do so. So that's why they're so much different than, say, like there's bears all over the world, and they've adapted slightly, but they're still bears. They still have the same kind of genes because they've been separated, but not for as long as the animals in Australia. Okay? Cool? Cool. All right, so the Ice Age. The Ice Age changed the landscape and climate for organisms. This forced organisms to adapt to survive. Okay, so If the organism wanted to continue living and pass on its genes, it had to have a gene that made it easier to live in the cold. And if it had that gene, it meant it lived for longer, which meant it passed on its genes to more offspring. That offspring was a little more hardy in the cold, so they passed on their genes to more offspring. And those genes subtly got compounded until you got an organism that could survive in the Ice Age. Many species, such as the mammoth, saber-toothed tiger, giant ground sloths, those are pretty cool. If you ever want to look at a cool picture, Google an image of a giant ground sloth. You know what a sloth looks like, right? They like crawl under, but they're big. They're enormous, like huge. Anyways, and mastodons thrived during the Ice Age. So they had everything they needed to compete, to live in the cold, right? Lots of really woolly fur. The saber-toothed tiger, was really adept at catching things because it was so big. Flightless birds did not fare so well as they were in direct competition with the mammals and other creatures for limited supplies of food and water, right? So they didn't have, if you put a saber-toothed tiger, say, up against a chicken for food, right, the saber-toothed tiger is probably going to win. Might eat the chicken too. Whereas birds that could fly were able to get it at a different food source than the flightless birds, so they maybe survived a little better and adapted a little better. All right, habitat destruction. So remember, there was 3 different types of driving forces. There was climate change, there was human interaction, and human interaction is what causes habitat destruction. So to build a house, we clear a field, right? To plant foods, we clear a forest, okay? And as we're just destroying those habitats, there's less places for animals to live. And habitat destruction is what causes species to become extinct. It can also open up new habitats that might provide an environment in which new species can evolve, thus demonstrating the resiliency of the earth. Okay, so kind of an example of this, maybe not an example. No, it's not an example. Anyways, for example, if a tree usually disperses its seed across a small area, is then met with a loss of habitat, it won't have enough habitat for the next generation. In order for the species to survive, the tree must evolve over generations to disperse its seeds farther, so there's a greater likelihood of the seed germinating. Okay, so you have a little tree, and the seeds go like there. Okay, you have the same tree, most of its seeds go there, and maybe one of its seeds goes way over here. Okay, and now we have a building here beside this tree. So now this little seed there won't survive. Okay, all these little seeds that dropped right close won't survive. But this one that went way over here, that's the one that'll survive. So it'll grow a tree over there. And then if a building grows there, building's built there, okay, because this tree now has the adaptation for being able to send its seeds further, it's going to send its seeds further yet. Okay, and be able to disperse its genetic material further away from itself, therefore creating more as people encroach on its territory, more trees further apart, and they will live for longer. Okay? All right, so fragmentation. The term habitat fragmentation includes 5 discrete phenomena. So the reduction of the total area of the habit, the decrease of the interior to edge ratio, the isolation of one habitat fragment from other areas of the habitat, the breaking up of one patch of habitat into several smaller patches, or the decrease in the average size of each patch of habitat. Okay, so all these kind of break up the habitat that the species are living in. The remaining habitat's fragments may be smaller or adjusted from the original habitat. Species that can move between fragments may use more than one fragment to continue normally and with no change in breeding. Species which cannot move between the fragments must evolve through a process called speciation. Okay, so maybe we have a big habitat before, and then it kind of gets broken up into a couple little ones. Okay, so for example, birds are going to be able to go through all of the habitats, right? But if there are people living in here, okay, bears aren't going to be able to travel through these different habitats. So the bears that are here are only going to be able to mate with the bears that are here. Okay, so let's say all of these are brown bears. They're all going to stay brown bears. But if maybe a bear up here is a spirit bear, okay, this population here is going to have a high concentration of spirit bear, right? Whereas down here, the spirit bear aren't going to be able to populate because they're not going to be able to get through the human population without being attacked, basically. Does that kind of make sense how that works? Mm-hmm. Yeah? Okay, cool. All right, so selective pressures. A selective pressure is any phenomenon which alters the behavior and fitness of living organisms within a given environment. It's the driving force of evolution and natural selection. So natural selection we talked about last class. It's one of the best, it's the one being the best known for, and is any selection from a purely natural process. Okay, so again, we kind of talked about how the finches evolved, right? They got spread across all the different islands in the Galapagos, and their food sources were different. So they evolved different beaks that could eat the different food sources. So the island that had lots of ants on it, for example, the birds might have longer, thinner beaks so that they could poke down into the anthill. The island that had lots of nuts on it, the birds would have really big, strong beaks so they could break into the nuts and get the food that way. And I think I'm kind of talking about evolution, like one animal evolves. But it's not just one animal that evolves, it's the animal that's the best suited for the environment lives the longest, right? If you put that finch with the long ant beak on the island that only had nuts, it's not going to have anything to eat and it's not going to survive very long. Whereas that finch that has the nut beak is going to be able to eat lots of nuts and have lots of babies and pass on the genes for the nut beak, right? And that beak is just going to get passed on because it's the one that works best in that area. So the longer things evolve, or the longer things are there and things are selecting for good positive outcomes, the more strong that feature is going to become. All right, so then there you have ecological selection. So any selection pressure that arose from environmental factors, or basically anything that isn't our next category that arose naturally. Okay, so anything that happens ecologically, ecology, remember, is just the environment. So anything that happened because of the environment. So sexual selection is a pressure selection in which individuals out-reproduce others of a population because they are better at securing mates. Okay, so kind of an example of this might be like a gorilla. In a gorilla community, the alpha male breeds with all the females, right? So that means that alpha male is using sexual selection to increase the number of offspring that have his genes. Okay, so all the babies that are born are going to be more like the alpha male. And it's going to just keep going and keep going. And then, of course, there's artificial selection, or any selective pressures that arose from non-natural means, such as selective breeding. And the example for this would be the modern-day dog, right? Before there were modern-day dogs, there were wolves. Wolves saw human settlements and were like, hey, cool, there's lots of food laying around here. So they'd hang out with the humans. And humans were like, hey, cool, this thing will protect my family. So they eventually said, okay, this one's really mean. I don't want him near my kids. But this one's kind of cute, and my kids like them, and it doesn't bite them. So we're going to take this one, and we're going to breed it with this other really nice one, and then it's going to have nice puppies. And then, oh, this one's really mean from this puppy litter, so maybe we won't breed him again, but this one's really nice. So they kept breeding the ones that had the traits that they wanted. So they wanted loyal animals, they wanted animals that weren't going to attack them, but they wanted animals that would still be aggressive enough to protect them. They wanted, you know, animals that would eventually become the modern day dog. So they picked out those traits, they bred for those traits, and eventually they got the dogs that we know today. They've actually been, I watched a TV show or a documentary once. They were, it wasn't a great reason why they were breeding them, but they were breeding foxes for their pelts, and they wanted to not have to deal with being bit by these foxes. So they ended up, you know, picking the nice foxes to breed, like they did with dogs, and they found that as they started breeding the nicer foxes, their ears actually started turning down and going floppy, like dogs' ears. So I don't know if that's just a gene that kind of goes along with nice dogs or what, but I thought it was kind of interesting that as the fox generations went down and they started breeding more like puppies, their ears got floppy. It's kind of cool. All right, so examples of selective pressures. So guppies are freshwater tropical fish that are favorites in aquariums because the males are beautifully colored. In the wild, guppies live in streams where they're the favorite snacks of larger fish. John Endler studied groups of guppies in Trinidad and found that the presence and absence of predators influenced the amount of coloring in male guppies. So if the guppies lived in a pond where there were lots of predators, obviously they weren't going to be colorful. And that makes sense, right? Because if a guppy's colorful, predator's going to be like, hey, there's lunch. Super easy to find. Whereas if the guppy kind of blends in with its surrounding, it's more difficult for the predator to find. But in a pool where there's not a lot of predators, the male guppies are going to get really colorful so they can find lots of females. And so therefore the colorful genes are going to be passed on, whereas in the pool that has predators, the muted colored genes are going to be passed on. So we kind of talked about the pepper moth last class. So the trees that the pepper moths lived on used to be a light color. To hide from their predators, the majority of pepper moths were that same light color, and they blended in very well. It was a birch tree, I think, so they were kind of white. After the Industrial Revolution, the trees turned dark with soot. This meant the light moths were easy to see, so dark moths were able to benefit and survive more often. So the dark moth gene was passed on more often because the dark moths were living longer. So the population of pepper moths in that particular forest ended up being mostly dark. So they used to be mostly light. Industrial Revolution came along. The pressure selected for the dark moths, and then you had mostly dark moths. And then dogs, we talked about. Dogs were bred from wolves. Wolves would stick close to human settlements because there was food available. The humans at these settlements realized the benefits of having wolves around, so they began to select for traits they found beneficial. They would breed these animals, and eventually the dogs we know and love today were evolved. Okay, so isolation is another driving force of evolution. So as long as a population has the opportunity to interbreed and exchange genes, they remain one species. As a population of species can only evolve into more than one species if groups within the population become isolated from each other by barriers that prevent the exchange of genes. So there are 3 types of isolating barriers. So you have your geographical barriers like mountains, rivers, oceans, those kind of things. Basically anything that people can't get across. Ecological barriers. Although groups are not geographically isolated, they may be isolated by such things as occupying different habitats or breeding areas, pH or salinity, so that just means how acidic or basic a water source is or how salty a water source is. And then reproductive isolation. Breeding between groups within a population may not be possible because of differences in courtship behavior, physical differences which prevent mating or failure of gametes to fuse. Okay, so for example, if two groups are isolated from each other and one group changes kind of maybe their mating call or when they breed, right, they're not going to be able to mate with the original group because their mating call is different. So the females don't know that the males from the new group want to have babies. Okay, we kind of talked about gradual and punctuated equilibrium last time, but a gradual evolution occurs where there's incremental change in small in comparison to time, so things just kind of gradually change. Punctuated evolution is where incremental change is very large, so that the time is just in discrete intervals, while most of the time there's virtually no change at all. So things just kind of jump. Changes happen when we're looking at evolutionary time, changes happen almost instantly. Okay, so convergent evolution. Convergent evolution creates analogous structures. Okay, and analogous structures are just structures that are the same between different species. Okay, so they have a similar form or function, but that are not present in the last common ancestor for those groups. In morphology, analogous traits will often arise where different species live in the similar ways and/or similar environments, so they face the same environmental factors. When occupying similar ecological niches, so that's where they live, similar problems lead to similar solutions. Okay, so if we look, we have three very different animals here. You got a fish, you got a land reptile, and you got a land mammal. And they all eventually kind of moved and migrated into the ocean, into the water. So if you look, a shark, an acanthosaur, and a porpoise all look very, very similar, but you know they're very, very different, right? But because this is like the fin, probably the best way to navigate through the water. Their tail fins, probably the best way to propel. So because it's the best way to work, all three of these kinds of animals, all three of these species evolved the same structures. Okay, coevolution. So this is when two totally separate species evolve together. Okay, so for example, we have a flower. It's kind of hard to see, but it's a bug that has a really long nose. Okay, so the flower, for some reason, started growing longer. So that means the bug's nose had to grow longer as well, so that they could so that the bug could get the nectar from the flower, and so that the flower could be pollinated. They had to evolve together so that they could work. Does that kind of make sense? Kind of, sort of. Okay, the adaptive radiation is a process in which organisms diversify rapidly into a multitude of new forms, particularly when a change in the environment makes new resources available, creates new challenges, and opens environmental niches. So this again these are Darwin's finches. Okay, so the different finches, their beaks evolved depending on the food source that was available to them. Am I almost done? Okay, mass extinctions. Mass extinctions is when half of the populations of species go away. We're on the brink of one right now, so we gotta take care of our environment. Those mass extinctions lead to more species being evolved because there's more place for them to evolve into. Okay, so think of when the dinosaurs went away, we got all these mammals. Right? Cool? Make sense?
Did you give out any handouts on the first day?
No, I don't. Everything I've pretty much